Minister, I have to say I have a fundamental problem with your bill, simply because it seems to me that the purpose of this bill is to transfer responsibility for a series of failures of government over decades on to the private sector, and in particular onto a small group in the private sector who are less well equipped to deal with, to bear the burden of that than another group in the private sector. Minister, before I was elected to this Dáil, I worked as an adjudicator in the private residential tenancies board, and in that time I was shocked. I suppose I was shocked by in the Clare area. I was shocked by the standard of tenancies that people were expected to live in. I was shocked by the complete inaction of the state apparatus to do anything about that. There was a complete lack of, there was almost the lack of engagement there was a complete lack of engagement by local authorities. The responsibility was given to local authorities to inspect rather than the Residential Tenancies Board, and local authorities simply weren't carrying out those inspections, which was essentially enabling rogue landlords to get away with the most appalling conditions. Now, I am aware that the Housing for All strategy has increased, has set a target of 25% of all tenancies to be inspected, and there was quite a big jump in the number of inspections in 2019. It fell off in 2020 and 2021 during COVID. I noticed from your latest response to a parliamentary question, it was up again substantially in 2022, in the first quarter of it. I hope that continues, because it is vitally important that landlords know that their tenancy will be inspected and it has to meet a certain minimum standard. Otherwise, you're essentially allowing a free-for-all in a market where there's a complete inequality between the tenant and the landlord. The other thing that I was shocked at was the complete powerlessness of landlords to evict a rogue tenant. Not maybe a tenant who couldn't afford to pay, which is very unfortunate for a landlord if that means that they are falling behind, because not every landlord buys as an investment, and certainly not every landlord is a huge investment trust. And I'm going to come to a particular example soon. There are lots of people who are accidental landlords who ended up being a landlord because they bought a house, couldn't afford to sell it because it was in negative equity for a number of years, and had to move to another part of the country, and often become tenants themselves and become landlords of their own home. And if people stopped paying rent, even if they couldn't pay rent, it still left that landlord going into arrears, and the length of time it took to get action from the PRTB was simply appalling at the time. Then there were other cases where there was a willful destruction of the tenancy by the tenant. And again, the landlord was completely hamstrung. That you can't, there's no right to peaceable re-entry as there is in a commercial tenancy. Many people in this House call for tenancies to be treated like a commercial tenancy in terms of that, you know, a tenancy to continue beyond the sale and that it be sold subject to a tenancy. But obviously, nobody is calling for the right to peaceable re-entry because it is somebody's home. So there kind of has to be, I think, a certain fairness in the legal framework that's applied. And I'm talking about small individual landlords who, I had photographic evidence of the most appalling destruction of what was once their family home, that they ended up having to let out and having to wait months, years in some instances, to be able to get the tenant out lawfully by relying on the state. That, as much as the failure to carry out inspections, is a failure of the state. During this summer, I had the luxury of actually being on holidays at one point of it, and I got a phone call from a constituent. I'm going to call him Sean for the purposes of this contribution. He explained to me that I know his family well. He and his wife left Ireland to go to another country with their child. They had planned to return to Ireland, having made some money like a lot of young couples. His wife became ill due to the deficiencies of our healthcare system, which are particularly pronounced in the Midwest. They decided they'd stay in the country they were in for treatment. She subsequently passed away from cancer. It was their joint wish before she passed away that their child would be brought back to their family home, that he would bring the child back to their family home and bring the child up in their family home in Ireland. He contacted the tenant that was in the family home and said, "I'd like you to leave." The tenant said, "Yeah." So he got back to Ireland and he said, "Remember I told you I'd like you to leave at this particular time?" He said, "Yeah, you never served a notice to quit on me." So I said, "Fair enough." So he served a notice, a 120-day notice to terminate the tenancy. On the 120th day, the tenant said, no, that's deficient. Of course I got it. Of course I knew what you meant. But it's deficient because it missed a couple of words in it. So I'm not moving anywhere. Start all over again. He started all over again. And now he's told that your government are telling him that he and his child cannot go into their home. Now, I appreciate that hard cases make bad law, but we have to acknowledge that not all landlords are unscrupulous, profit-loving corporations that are investing. But in fact, if we continue down the road we're on, then the only people who certainly wouldn't like to be a tenant and have a dodgy landlord, but I certainly wouldn't want to be a landlord either in Ireland. The only people who will want to be landlords will be these huge corporations, because they're the only people with pockets deep enough that my constituent is living in what is now overcrowded accommodation with other family members, and his infant son having returned to Ireland, bemoaning the fact that he brought his son, who's a citizen of Ireland, back to this country. As far as he's concerned, he's been utterly let down by the state. And as much as his tenant might feel let down by the state because there isn't rental accommodation, that is not a failure of my constituent or people like him. Yet they are the ones who are going to bear the brunt of this. Not, at least not yet, not a government and previous governments that simply failed to invest adequately in the Private Residential Tenancies Board to make sure it was fit for purpose, failed to make sure there were enough inspections to disincentivise rogue landlords, but most fundamentally failed to invest in housing and build houses. So notwithstanding that momentous failure over decades by the government, it's now being made his problem. His tenant's problem is his problem. And his own child's problem is his problem on top of that. Is that fair, Minister? Because if it is not disproportionate to say to somebody, I can still evict you because you can't pay rent, which is the fundamental problem. But if it is okay to evict somebody because they cannot pay rent, then why can my constituent or somebody like him not say, look, I have the utmost sympathy for you, but I need that house as much as you do. I appreciate it's your home, but it is my home. I bought it. I'm paying the mortgage, and I want to bring up my son in my home as my wife wanted. So, Minister, I suggest it is, if you're going to exclude people who can't pay rent, and that is proportionate, then I say it is utterly disproportionate to not allow somebody to serve a notice to quit so that they can re-enter their home. And of course, I'm introducing an amendment to that effect, which you might be minded to accept, because that's something that, of course, won't affect the huge corporations, because they're not going to want to enter a home. I mean, it's only individuals will want to enter a home for their own purpose or for a family member. So I'd urge you to think about that, because as far as I can see, All you're doing is transferring responsibility for a problem that you and previous, not you alone, Minister, but previous governments have contributed to, onto the private sector, and that seems to me to be utterly disproportionate. Thank you.